Heraclitus is perhaps one of the most important philosophers in all of Western philosophy, but especially in terms of the Presocratics, I think he has the most influence on modern philosophy today. If you wish to understand any of the idealist philosophies, so Hegel or Heidegger, or if you want to understand any of these systematic idealist thinkers, you really need to have an understanding of Heraclitus. And like all the pre-Socratics, Heraclitus's work is defined by the fact that we have so little of it. We only have very short fragments of his work, and as such, it's very difficult to understand, partially because he doesn't do most of the philosophizing for us. In many of these modern and very systematic philosophies, we can see philosophers such as Hegel and Heidegger taking us very clearly through their philosophies. Now, of course, they make statements that are very categorical and very clear and very to the point, but they will often contextualize these with examples and things like that to make it more clear exactly what they're talking about. Heraclitus is a little bit more feels a little bit more like a literary work than a philosophical work, in the sense that you have to do a little bit more interpretation than maybe you would with a philosopher, considering that most of the modern philosophy is built around the fact that you're explaining your thinking and things like that, and doesn't necessarily have to be as much interpreted as it must be said. Now, Heraclitus comes up with a lot of ideas that are very important. I think flux is his biggest idea that he comes up with. He also talks about the one, or that everything is one. And in Hegel, we get this idea of the one with the capital O, a very important concept for systematic philosophy such as Hegel's. So we're going to take a look at Heraclitus and a couple of his fragments and kind of deal with what he's trying to say so that you can get an idea of his philosophy. I think it's a great thing to read. Pre-Socratic philosophy is very interesting to read compared to other philosophers, because you really find yourself face to face with these ideas rather than trying to sift through maybe some of the maybe dirging aspects of the philosophy of someone like Hegel or Heidegger, who can often be very difficult to understand exactly what they're saying just because there's so much fluff. There is no fluff in pre-Socratic philosophy except for maybe a select few. Heraclitus bears a lot of similarities to me between Hegel and himself, but he also has some Nietzschean aspects in him, and I think that's where we'll start, is with those Nietzschean aspects. Nietzsche, in his Gay Science, talks about the fact that many people seem to lack an intellectual conscience, and I think Heraclitus very aptly displays what that lack of an intellectual conscience looks like. In 22b73, the fragment that we have, he says, "One ought not to act and speak like people asleep." So there's this idea that there are certain people who are asleep, but he's saying that these people who are asleep can act and speak. Now, of course, this doesn't make much sense to us, because usually people don't act or speak anything when they're sleeping. They're merely in their dreams and in their beds, partaking of their own intellectual games per se. But I think this is where we see that he's really not talking about people being literally asleep, but figuratively asleep. And this is that lack of an intellectual conscience that Nietzsche would talk about. He goes on to say in 22b89, "For the waking there is one common world, but when asleep each person turns away to a private one." And I have in my notes here the idea of Hegel's unhappy conscience. I think Hegel preemptively understands people like Nietzsche when he talks about the unhappy consciousness or the unhappy conscience. And we see this. He's talking about, Heraclitus is talking about when people are asleep, each person has a private world. And he says that, of course, for those who are awake, which, if you know anything about like Plato's allegory of the cave, we can kind of think of something like that, of people coming into the light and being able to see the world as one, or objectively, is kind of a good way to understand it. But he said when people are asleep, they turn into their own private world. And here we see kind of a critique of subjectivism, which is very interesting. Now here, Heraclitus starts to talk about the one, but not only the one, but he juxtaposes this with the idea of a multiplicity or a many, and he talks about things being whole and not whole simultaneously, which feels very reminiscent of the twofold Hegelian nature that he often talks about. The idea that the law of non-contradiction doesn't really suit us any longer, and maybe that might sound a bit pejorative, like I'm saying that he just wanted to do away with the law of non-contradiction. But we see even back in Heraclitus's work, as we read on, we'll see that even he wishes to call this into question. In 22b50, he says, "Listening not to me, but to the Logos, it is wise to agree that all things are one." Here, the idea of the Logos, which is one of the most broad terms in Western philosophy. This can mean something like a conversation or rationality or kind of an ordering principle or something like this. And he goes on to say in 22b10, "Things taken together are whole and not whole. Something which is being brought together and brought apart, in tune and out of tune. Out of all things there comes a unity, and out of unity all things." So this is kind of talking about the idea that the one, or the entirety of the world, can be both one entity, but also split into determinate parts, that we can have chairs and tables and people and cameras and books and things of this sort, but yet they are all one. And of course, this is something that Hegel would go on to really try to pound into our brains, the idea that the world is self-same and that everything is spirit. So we see him talking about, out of all things there comes a unity, and out of a unity all things. So there's multiple things, but yet it's all a unity, it's all a one. Now here we're starting to link the idea of the one and the fact that the one is a collection of multiple determinate entities that are classified as one and multiple at the same time. We see Heraclitus expand upon this a little, and the idea that the law of non-contradiction should be put to the side, which is something Hegel would have said, we see this being preempted in Heraclitus's work, and this is why it's so important. In 22b59, he says the track of writing is straight and crooked. Very interesting, because we could obviously see this both ways. And he goes on to say in 22b60, the road up and the road down are one and the same. Now, this road up and road down one is particularly interesting because we see kind of this idea of a frame of reference being taken into account. The fact that the road up and the road down are the same entity, but the way in which they are given being, namely as a use, as a road which is meant to be traveled up, they obtain a particular ontology or a particular kind of being in which they are given a description which is separate from the physical entity itself. And in this sense, we can see that based on your frame of reference, you can have a road up and a road down in the same physical entity. Here we get into the idea of rivers and the idea of flux. And this is the idea that things are always changing, basically. He says in 22b12, upon those who step into the same rivers, different and again different waters flow. He goes on to say, it is not possible to step twice into the same river. It scatters and again comes together and approaches and recedes. We step into and we do not step into the same rivers. We are and we are not. So we see this systematic kind of creation of an idea, because we're talking about rivers here in the beginning, but at the end he says we are and we are not. So he wants to link this to humans somehow. And of course what he's trying to do is he's saying that, well, when we go into a river at one point in time, point A, and we go into it at a different time, point B, the river is not necessarily physically the same. The position of all the waves and water particles have changed. The outsides of the river may have expanded a little as the water erodes on the sides of the bank. But at the same time, we still call this river the same thing, especially if we step into it at two particularly close intervals of time. This, of course, isn't necessarily philosophized about in Heraclitus, and this is what I was talking about the idea that we have to do a lot of that philosophizing. So Heraclitus is intrigued by this idea that we call it the same river, yet on what grounds? He seeks to make us think about the fact that even though things are always changing, we give labels to things such as rivers or tables or people. People are a very dynamic entity, whereas something like a table may seem fairly simple. But Heraclitus wants to point out the fact that something like a river is always changing. And there's this interesting little nugget of kind of philosophy of language that fits into there, which is that we employ language and give a defining characteristic or genus or specific meaning to something which is unspecific, which is changing, which is never the same. We're trying to make something which is always in flux, not in flux. So when we understand something like a river, this is kind of baked into the definition of the river itself. A river is a flowing body of water. It's this constantly changing thing, yet which we nevertheless have an understanding for. So we see that Heraclitus is very keen on the idea that it's not merely a matter of interpretation whether or not it is the same river or not, but rather that it is both. We step into and we do not step into the same rivers. And he's very clear about this. And we often feel like Hegel is the guy who's scrapping the law of non-contradiction, but actually it's really Heraclitus who is doing it first, not that it's a competition. And of course, he goes on to say, we are and we are not. Meaning we have a definite being as humans. We have methods by which we can understand what a human is. But of course, we are also not these standards by which we choose to define what a human is. Maybe we want to understand what a human is, and we say, well, they have 2 legs and 2 arms, and they can think, and usually they can walk and speak. And for every one of these things which seem integral to the human character, we can find exceptions to the rule. There are people who are amputees who don't have all their limbs. There are people with cognitive disabilities which may interfere with them speaking or even having a similar cognitive ability, such that if you were to compare their cognitive function to something like another primate, maybe a chimpanzee, there are people who we would classify as people who physically would seem to have the same capabilities of things that are not people, and not the same physical capabilities of things we typically would associate with people, whether that be cognitive abilities or whether that be their ability to walk or run or speak or hear or see or things like this. So Heraclitus is almost cautioning us about an idea of being that is concrete and solid. And he wants to make us question whether or not we can really do that. As a last dig into Heraclitus, we again have a very interesting idea in which the law of non-contradiction is kind of shattered. He says in 22b62, immortal immortals, mortal immortals, living the death of the others and dying their life. So this is a very perplexing passage, which I'd like to leave up to the watcher to philosophize about. But we see some very important senses in which Heraclitus is integral to a lot of the modern understanding of idealism, or, really any modern philosophy. Idealism kind of really began as an official field of discipline with Hegel and Schelling and Hölderlin reading Heraclitus together. And of course, you can find parallels that may not be explicitly stated from Heraclitus to other thinkers all the time. So I think studying Heraclitus is very interesting. He, like the other Presocratics, has a very wide array of things that he talks about. So it's maybe not as systematic as people like Hegel, but it's much more widespread, and you get the feeling of a complete person in a very short amount of works. So I hope this has been helpful, and I'll see you in another one.